My ex-husband took my alimony, invested it in Bitcoin, and became a millionaire. Now he's flaunting his wealth and wants to make things right after years of silence. For as long as I could remember, I had always been the kind of person who played by the rules. I went to school, worked hard, and did everything expected of me. But life, as it often does, threw curveballs that I wasn't prepared for. The biggest one came in the form of my marriage to Derek. Derek and I met in college, both just starting out, full of dreams and excitement. He was charismatic, a little reckless, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the room. I was drawn to him immediately, and before I knew it, we were married, moving in together, and planning our future. In the beginning, it was all fun. We had late-night talks, spontaneous trips, and a love that seemed so real. But soon after the honeymoon phase wore off, things started to change. Derek became distant. He wasn't the same person who'd swept me off my feet. I noticed how often he stayed late at work, how he seemed preoccupied with something I couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was just stress. Work was demanding and life can be overwhelming sometimes. But then came the first sign that things weren't as they seemed. Derek was no longer interested in talking about our future or even the present. He was always on his phone, checking his emails, staring at screens. I couldn't help but feel that something was slipping away, but I couldn't put my finger on it. One night, after coming home early from a dinner with friends, I found him sitting in front of his laptop, his face illuminated by the screen. There was an urgency in his movements, a sense that he was working on something big. I didn't want to interrupt him, but something told me I should. I peeked over his shoulder, and that's when I saw it. The screen was filled with charts, numbers, and what looked like a trading platform. The words Bitcoin flashed across the screen, and I realized he was investing in cryptocurrency. At first, I didn't understand it. Bitcoin? What was that? But Derek was glued to it. He was obsessed. He talked about Bitcoin like it was the key to our future, like this was his way of making something out of nothing. I wasn't particularly interested in it, but I was willing to trust him. After all, he'd always been the one to take the risks. He had that wild, adventurous side, and I'd always admired it, even if it made me uneasy at times. As the months went on, Derek became more and more fixated on Bitcoin. The volatility of the market seemed to fuel his drive. I started noticing that he was less present in our marriage, less interested in what I had to say. I would try to talk to him about our relationship, about where we were going, but his mind was always elsewhere, consumed by the numbers on the screen. And then, in what felt like the blink of an eye, everything changed. One night, Derek came to me, his eyes wide with excitement. "I did it," he said, barely able to contain himself. "I made it. We've made it." At first, I thought he was talking about something else, maybe a promotion or some big work achievement. But when I asked what he meant, he told me that the Bitcoin investments had paid off, big time. He'd turned a small amount of money into something much, much larger. He was talking millions. I didn't know how to feel. On one hand, it was incredible. Who wouldn't want to hear that their partner had become a millionaire? But on the other hand, I felt this gnawing sense of unease. All of this had happened without me being involved, without me having any say in the decisions. Derek hadn't consulted me, hadn't asked for my opinion. It felt like he had made all of this happen without me, and I was left in the dust, watching from the sidelines. A few months later, we got divorced. It wasn't a sudden decision. By the time I filed for divorce, our marriage had been falling apart for a long time. Derek was no longer the man I had married. He was consumed by his wealth, by the success he had found in Bitcoin. The more money he made, the more distant he became. I couldn't compete with his obsession, and I didn't want to. The love had faded long before the divorce papers were signed. The alimony I received wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to keep me comfortable. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about fairness. It was about the years I had spent in the marriage, the years I had sacrificed. But what I didn't realize was that my alimony was about to take a turn I never saw coming. Derek, with all his newfound wealth, didn't pay me as much attention as he used to. He didn't care about how I was doing or whether I was struggling. I was just another part of his past. The money, however, remained a constant. I kept receiving my alimony checks, but they never seemed to mean anything more than a small contribution to the wealth that Derek was amassing. I had no idea how much he had invested in Bitcoin, how much he had made, or how much of my alimony had gone into it. But then one day a message popped up on my phone. It was from Derek. I hadn't heard from him in years. Not since the divorce. He'd moved on, living a life of luxury, and I had moved on too. The message was simple. I want to make things right. Let's talk. I didn't know what to make of it. Make things right? What did that even mean? Was this some kind of attempt at reconciliation, or was it just another way for him to flaunt the wealth he had gained from my alimony? I sat on the message for days. I didn't know if I was ready to hear whatever he had to say. Part of me wanted to let go, to forget about him and the way he had turned his back on me. But another part of me wondered if there was more to this. Was he feeling guilty? Did he regret what he had done? I eventually agreed to meet him. When I walked into the cafe where we'd agreed to meet, I barely recognized Derek. He was different, confident, polished, and exuding the kind of wealth that I had never seen in him before. He was wearing an expensive suit, his watch gleaming under the soft lights of the cafe. His hair was neatly styled, and he had a calm, composed air about him. We sat down across from each other, and for a moment, it felt like time had stood still. But it wasn't the same. There was a tension between us, a distance that had grown over the years. Derek, for all his wealth, was a stranger to me. "I've been thinking about you," he began, his voice low. "About everything. About what happened." I wasn't sure how to respond. How could I possibly explain how I felt about all of this? How could I express the years of resentment, of feeling betrayed and forgotten? He wasn't the man I had married. He wasn't the man I had trusted. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice sincere. "I should have involved you more. I should have shared it with you. But I was so caught up in everything, in the success, in the money, that I lost sight of what really mattered." I didn't know if I believed him. Was this really an apology, or was it just an attempt to clear his conscience? I didn't know if I cared anymore. I had spent so long trying to move on from him, from the hurt, from the anger that boiled inside me whenever I thought about what he had done. But now here he was, flaunting his wealth, claiming that he wanted to make things right. "I just want you to know," he continued, "that I didn't forget about you. I made mistakes. And I want to fix them." I couldn't bring myself to say anything for a long time. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell him how much he had hurt me, how much he had changed. But another part of me wondered if this was the closure I had needed all along. Eventually I stood up. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. The man who had once meant everything to me was now just a stranger in a fancy suit. His wealth didn't matter to me anymore. I had built my life without him, without the need for his approval or his money. "I don't need you to make things right," I said softly. "I've already done that for myself." I walked out of that cafe with a sense of finality I hadn't expected. Derek had tried to come back into my life, but the truth was, he no longer had any place in it. I had learned to live without him, to stand on my own. And that was worth more than any amount of money he could flaunt.